Have you ever truly stopped to consider who fed the vast populations of the world in 770 AD? What if the grand narratives of history, filled with kings and battles, have completely overlooked the essential backbreaking work that sustained entire societies, work performed by women? Get ready to peel back the layers of a forgotten past and discover the hidden truths of medieval agriculture, because a huge part of the story, stretching back over 1,000 years, has been left untold. Number 6. Invisible labor in the fields. Imagine the dawn breaking over a small farming village in 770. The air is crisp, maybe a little damp, and the silence is only broken by the distant crow of a rooster or the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. As the sun begins to paint the sky with hues of orange and pink, the men often prepare their plows, readying their oxen for the heavy work of turning the earth. This image, deeply ingrained in our collective memory of medieval farming, often dominates the narrative. It's the powerful, visible act of breaking ground, a symbol of man's dominion over nature, that gets recorded in histories and celebrated in lore. But what about the women? Where were they in this dawn ritual? And what were they doing that was just as vital, yet consistently overlooked? While the men might have been focused on the dramatic act of plowing, women were already knee-deep, sometimes literally, in the countless other essential tasks that made the fields productive. Their labor was often less about brute force applied to large animals and heavy implements, and more about intricate, persistent, and unceasing diligence. Think of the act of weeding. It sounds simple, even mundane, but in 770, without chemical herbicides, weeding was a constant battle against nature's relentless desire to reclaim cultivated land. Every unwanted plant competing for nutrients, water, and sunlight directly threatened the survival of the crops. Women, often with young children strapped to their backs or playing nearby, would spend countless hours bent over, meticulously pulling out invasive weeds by hand. This wasn't a seasonal task. It was a continuous engagement with the soil, requiring an intimate knowledge of what belonged and what didn't, what was food and what was a threat. The sheer volume of this work across acres of cultivated land was staggering, yet it was rarely seen as farming in the same esteemed way as plowing or harvesting the primary grain. It was just part of the daily grind, essential but unnoticed in the grand scheme of official records. Beyond weeding, consider the endless task of clearing stones. Every year, as the earth froze and thawed, new rocks would rise to the surface of the fields, a constant obstacle to plowing and a danger to both tools and feet. Gathering these stones, carrying them to the edges of the fields, or using them to build walls, was a never-ending chore. It required strength, endurance, and a consistent effort that women regularly contributed to, often alongside other family members. This wasn't a quick job. It was a seasonal imperative, crucial for maintaining the viability of the land for future cultivation. Yet, who would record the hundreds of stones a woman might pick up in a day? It was just part of the unseen maintenance, a silent contribution to the farm's longevity. When it came to planting, while men might have managed the broader distribution of seeds for major grain crops, women were often responsible for the more delicate and detailed sowing of smaller, but no less important plants. This included vegetables for the family garden, herbs for medicine and cooking, and sometimes even specific rows of legumes within the main fields. The precision required for these tasks, the understanding of optimal spacing and depth for different seeds, was a form of specialized knowledge. Imagine the nimble fingers carefully dropping individual seeds into prepared soil, a task that demanded patience and a deep connection to the earth. This wasn't merely scattering seeds. It was the meticulous planting of life, ensuring future sustenance. Yet, the grandeur of a man broadcasting grain across a vast field often overshadowed the vital contribution of a woman carefully planting the small but essential kitchen garden. that provided daily nourishment and resilience. The harvest season, often depicted as a communal effort, still saw specific roles emerge that were less celebrated for women. While men might have been seen swinging scythes in broad arcs to cut down swaths of grain, women often followed behind, painstakingly gathering the fallen stalks, binding them into sheaves, and carrying them to the threshing floor. This gleaning, the act of collecting leftover grain after the main harvest, was particularly important. It ensured that no food was wasted, providing a crucial supplement to the family's diet, especially in lean years. This was an act of resourcefulness and frugality, making every last bit count. It was often the task of women and children, a labor of love and necessity, but again, one that faded into the background compared to the more dramatic acts of cutting and threshing. The weight of the sheaves, the repetitive bending and lifting under the hot sun, the urgency of collecting every last grain before it rotted or was eaten by pests. This was an immense physical and mental burden that often fell squarely on women's shoulders, ensuring the full yield of the field was secured for the winter. Even the most iconic male farming task, plowing, might have seen women playing a less visible but equally vital role. While they generally did not handle the heavy plows themselves, women were often instrumental in guiding the oxen, maintaining their pace, or even clearing obstacles in the furrow ahead. Their presence was often that of assistance, facilitating the main work, ensuring its smooth execution. This supportive role, while not pulling the plow in the literal sense, was nonetheless an active engagement with the central farming operation. Their understanding of animal behavior, their ability to communicate with the oxen, and their physical presence in the field ensured the work could continue efficiently. This was not mere observation. It was active participation, a critical component of the plowing process, yet it was often subsumed under the male lead's effort. Consider also the sheer logistics of supporting farm labor. In 770, and farming was an all-day, every-day endeavor during peak seasons. Farm workers, whether family members or hired hands, needed constant sustenance. Women were primarily responsible for preparing and bringing meals to the fields, often multiple times a day. This involved not just cooking, but grinding grain, fetching water, chopping firewood, and then transporting the food, sometimes over considerable distances, to wherever the men were working. This continuous provision of nourishment was absolutely critical to maintaining the energy and productivity of the workforce. A farmer cannot plow if he is hungry, and without the consistent supply of food, the entire operation would grind to a halt. This logistical support, ensuring that the male labor force was fed and hydrated, was fundamental to the farm's output, yet it was rarely considered farming itself. It was women's work, domestic in nature, and thus somehow separate from the real work of the fields, even though it was completely interdependent. The hot sun, the heavy containers, the countless trips back and forth. This was a form of endurance labor essential to the continuation of the core agricultural tasks. The very definition of farmer in the medieval period was often implicitly male. Land ownership, tenancy agreements, and official records almost exclusively listed men as the heads of households and the primary agricultural producers. Women, even if they were doing the majority of the daily essential work, were often seen as dependents or assistants. Their labor was simply integrated into the household's survival rather than recognized as a distinct economic or productive contribution. This systemic invisibility meant that their skills, their hours of toil, and their crucial role in ensuring the family's survival went largely unrecorded and uncelebrated in the official historical narrative. It was a silent agreement that while women worked on the farm, they were not truly farmers in the way men were perceived. This social construct perpetuated the overlooking of their vital contributions, making their extensive field labor seem like a natural extension of their domestic duties rather than a professional occupation. The absence of women's names in land deeds, tax registers, and labor agreements effectively erased their direct contributions from the historical record, leaving us with an incomplete and biased picture of agricultural life in 770. Their calloused hands, their sun-baked faces, and their weary backs were testaments to a labor that, despite its critical importance, remained largely unseen and unspoken. Number 5. The unsung architects of daily survival, beyond the visible or invisible labor in the fields. Women in 770 AD were the undisputed architects of daily survival within the farm household. Their contributions here were so deeply intertwined with the very fabric of life that they were often dismissed as mere domestic duties, yet without them, the entire agricultural enterprise would have crumbled. These were the unseen operations that kept the engines of the farm running, the continuous demanding work that transformed raw farm produce into sustenance and ensured the well-being of the entire family and workforce. Consider the act of food preparation. In 770, this was not a simple matter of opening a package or turning on a stove. It was a Herculean effort that began long before the ingredients hit the pot grain. The staple of the medieval diet had to be processed. This often meant hours of grinding it into flour using heavy cornstones, a laborious and repetitive task that required significant physical exertion. Imagine the steady rhythm, the pushing and turning of the top stone against the bottom, the coarse flour slowly emerging, dusted over hands and clothes. This was a daily necessity, and it often fell to the women of the household. Without their consistent effort, the raw grain from the fields would be inedible, and the family would starve. They were, in essence, the first stage of food processing, turning the harvest into a usable form. Then came the baking bread, was the cornerstone of every meal. Baking loaves for a large farm family meant kneading vast quantities of dough, tending to a fire, and managing the temperamental heat of an oven, often an outdoor structure that had to be carefully maintained. This was a skill that demanded precision and experience. Too hot, and the bread would burn. Too cool, and it would be doughy. The smell of freshly baked bread might have been a comforting aroma, but it was the result of hours of work, from milling the flour to tending the fire and carefully watching the loaves. This wasn't just cooking. It was a fundamental part of the farm's food supply chain, transforming raw ingredients into the fuel that powered every working body. But food preparation wasn't just about bread. It was about creating meals from scratch, using whatever was available from the farm or gathered from the surrounding wilderness. This involved knowledge of herbs, vegetables, and wild edibles, and the skill to combine them into nourishing meals. It also meant managing the precious and often scarce supplies, making every portion count. Imagine a woman meticulously preparing a stew, adding just the right amount of dried herbs she had gathered and preserved months earlier, ensuring flavor and nutrition. This was a culinary art, born of necessity, vital for maintaining health and energy. Beyond daily meals, there was the monumental task of food preservation. In a world without refrigeration, survival through the lean winter months depended entirely on successful preservation techniques. Women were the masters of this craft. They dried fruits and vegetables in the sun or over slow fires, creating stores that would last for months. They salted and smoked meat and fish, turning perishable goods into long-lasting provisions. They pickled vegetables in brine or vinegar, a process that required careful measurement and preparation. They made cheese and butter from milk, extending the shelf life of dairy products. Each of these processes was time-consuming, labor-intensive, and demanded a deep understanding of natural processes and chemistry. A single mistake could lead to spoilage, wasting precious food and threatening the family's survival. Imagine the pungent smell of salt-curing meat, the meticulous layering of vegetables in brine, the constant turning of butter in a churn. These tasks, often performed during harvest gluts, were critical for ensuring food security for the entire year, a silent guarantee against hunger and famine. Yet, the work of drying apples or brining cabbage was rarely seen as contributing to the agricultural output, in the same way as planting the apple trees or growing the cabbage in the first place. Then there was the constant cycle of providing clean water and managing waste. Water had to be fetched, often from a well or stream, some distance from the homestead, carried in heavy buckets. This was a daily, repetitive chore, essential for cooking, drinking, and sanitation. Imagine the hundreds of trips to the well, the aching arms, the cold water splashed on bare skin in winter. Waste management, too, was crucial for hygiene and preventing disease. Women were responsible for keeping the living spaces clean, managing animal waste where it entered the domestic sphere, and ensuring basic sanitation. This unseen battle against filth and disease was a fundamental component of maintaining a healthy household, without which the farm's workforce would constantly be plagued by illness. Directly impacting its productivity, child rearing in 770 AD was inextricably linked to farm productivity. Women were responsible for raising the next generation of farmers. This meant not just feeding and clothing children, but teaching them essential skills, instilling work ethic, and preparing them to contribute to the family farm from a very young age. While men might teach boys how to plow or manage livestock, women taught girls how to gather wild edibles, preserve food, care for smaller animals, weed gardens, and perform countless domestic chores. This informal education was crucial for passing on vital knowledge and skills, ensuring the continuity of the farm across generations. Children of the farm were its future labor force, and their upbringing, primarily overseen by women, was an investment in the farm's long-term viability. The immense time and energy dedicated to childcare, even while performing other arduous tasks, was an unquantifiable but fundamental contribution to the farm's future. Beyond these fundamental necessities, women often engaged in various forms of craft that supported the farm's economy. They might have processed wool from the sheep into yarn, and then into rough woolen goods for the family. While not farming in the sense of growing crops, this transformation of animal products into usable goods was a direct economic contribution, providing clothing and warmth without needing to trade for it. They might have made candles from animal fats or prepared medicinal remedies from gathered herbs, ensuring the household's self-sufficiency and health. These activities, often performed in the evenings after a day of field work or during less demanding seasons, further cemented their role as the central hub of household production and survival. The cumulative effect of these domestic tasks was enormous. They represented a constant, never-ending cycle of labor that provided food, warmth, health, and future labor for the entire farm unit. Yet, because these tasks were confined to the private sphere of the home, they were culturally devalued compared to the public sphere of field labor or market transactions, which were typically dominated by men. The value of a freshly baked loaf of bread, of a well-preserved barrel of salted fish, of a healthy, clean child ready to work, was immeasurable. Yet it was rarely attributed to the individual's skill and tireless effort of the woman who produced it. Instead, it was simply her duty, an expected part of her role, and therefore, paradoxically, rendered invisible in its true economic and survival impact. The farm could not function for a single day without this constant, unsung labor that built the very foundations of its existence. Women were the silent, essential engineers of daily survival, holding the entire agricultural system together through their relentless work and profound knowledge. Number 4. Beyond the hearth, economic contributions. When we think of economy in 770 AD, our minds often jump to large-scale trade, noble estates, or the exchange of high-value goods. Farming, in this context, is often seen as the foundational production, with the surplus then entering broader markets. However, the economic contributions of women on farms in 770 AD extended far beyond just consuming what was produced. They were active participants in sustaining and sometimes expanding the farm's financial viability. Their economic activities were frequently underestimated, often hidden behind the veil of household management or overshadowed by male-centric transactions. One of the most significant yet frequently unacknowledged economic contributions was the careful management of household resources and the prevention of waste. In a subsistence economy, every morsel of food, every scrap of material held immense value. Women were often the primary decision-makers regarding how the farm's produce was used. This wasn't just about cooking, it was about strategic allocation. They decided how much grain was set aside for daily consumption versus how much was saved for seed for the next season. They managed the family's pantry, deciding which foods were eaten first and which were preserved for longer-term use. This required careful planning, budgeting of resources, not money, and an intimate understanding of the cycles of abundance and scarcity throughout the year. Imagine the careful measuring of grain, the thoughtful portioning of meat, the strategic rotation of preserved goods to ensure nothing spoiled before it could be consumed. This meticulous resource management directly impacted the farm's sustainability and its ability to weather difficult periods. Without their shrewd oversight, waste could quickly deplete the family's reserves, leading to hunger or even starvation. This was a form of internal economics, managing the farm's output to meet its internal needs, thereby reducing the need for external purchases and maximizing the family's self-sufficiency. Furthermore, women were often central to the processing of raw agricultural products into more valuable, marketable goods. While men might shear the sheep, it was often women who processed the wool into yarn or even finished textiles. This transformation added significant value to the raw material. A raw fleece had a certain worth, but a spindle of spun yarn or a piece of rough woven cloth could be traded or sold for a much higher price. This secondary production, often carried out in the home, was a direct economic activity that brought in supplementary income or allowed the family to barter for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Imagine the rhythmic hum of a spinning wheel, the deft movements of hands turning raw wool into strong thread, a testament to hours of skilled labor. This craft was not merely a pastime, it was an economic lifeline, a way to diversify the farm's income streams or ensure the family's clothing needs were met without external expense. Similarly, dairy products were often processed and managed by women. They milked cows and goats, but more importantly, they transformed perishable milk into storable, tradable products like cheese and butter. These items, especially cheese, could be stored for extended periods and were valuable commodities for sale or barter at local markets. A wheel of cheese represented not just the milk from the cow, but the labor, knowledge, and skill of the woman who made it, a concentrated form of dairy wealth. These products were often a direct source of cash income or vital trade goods, allowing the farm household to acquire things it couldn't produce, like salt metal tools or imported luxuries. Production of cheese and butter required specific techniques, careful hygiene, and an understanding of fermentation and aging processes. This was a sophisticated culinary science, and its economic impact was significant. Beyond processing, women often played a direct, though sometimes unacknowledged, role in local market exchange. While men might be seen as the primary representatives at larger regional markets, women frequently handled the sale or barter of smaller farm surpluses, particularly eggs, poultry, garden vegetables, herbs, and dairy products, at local village markets or through direct exchange with neighbors. These smaller transactions, while perhaps not generating vast sums of wealth, were crucial for acquiring small necessities or supplementary income. A woman might trade a basket of eggs for a small amount of salt, or a few bundles of herbs for some lamp oil. These microeconomies were vital for daily living and for making the farm self-sufficient in myriad ways. Their networks of exchange and their knowledge of local needs were invaluable. They understood who needed what, when, and at what price, making them shrewd local traders. Furthermore, women's involvement in the cultivation of specific cash crops for household use, even if not for large-scale market, provided crucial economic benefits. This might include growing specific medicinal herbs, dye plants, or fibers like flax. While often grown in small plots, the output of these plants reduced the need to purchase these items effectively, saving the family money or providing goods that could be bartered. For example, the flax harvested and processed by women could be spun into linen thread used for clothing or even sold. This internal economy of self-sufficiency, reducing external dependencies, was a powerful economic contribution, even if it didn't involve money changing hands on a grand scale. The economic value of women's care for livestock, particularly smaller animals like chickens, geese, and pigs, was also immense. While men might manage larger animals for plowing or breeding, women often tended to the poultry, ensuring egg production, raising chicks, and preparing birds for consumption or sale. They also often managed the family's pigs, which were vital for meat and fat. Consistent care for these animals, from feeding to cleaning to ensuring their health, directly contributed to the farm's protein supply and its potential for marketable surpluses. An abundance of eggs, or a healthy pig ready for slaughter, represented real tangible wealth for the family, all underpinned by women's daily diligent care. Finally, the unpaid labor of women effectively subsidized the farm's operations. If these countless tasks, from grinding flour to preserving food, from caring for children to processing wool, had to be performed by hired labor, the cost would have been astronomical, rendering many small farms economically unviable. By providing this immense, diverse, and skilled labor without direct wages, women were, in essence, contributing their entire productive capacity to the farm, allowing it to sustain itself and produce surpluses. This hidden subsidy was the bedrock of the medieval agricultural economy, yet it was almost entirely invisible in any formal economic reckoning. There were no columns for value of female labor in manorial records or tax assessments. It was simply assumed as part of the patriarchal structure, and therefore its profound economic impact was consistently overlooked. Their tireless efforts and skills were not merely helping out. They were the essential gears of the farm's economic engine, ensuring its survival and enabling its modest prosperity. Number 3. The hidden hand in animal husbandry. When the tales of medieval farming unfold, the image of a farmer, often a man, leading his powerful oxen to the plow or tending to a flock of sheep, is frequently brought to the forefront. This focus on large draft animals and primary livestock, crucial as they were, often overshadows the immense and continuous contributions of women to animal husbandry in 770. While men might have been the public face of managing the larger, more visible farm animals, women were the hidden hands, the constant caregivers, and often the primary processors of animal products, ensuring the health, productivity, and economic viability of the entire farm's animal population. Milking cows and goats was a routine, often twice daily task that frequently fell to women. This wasn't a quick job. It required patience, skill, and consistency. Poorly milked animal could lead to reduced milk production or even health problems for the animal. Imagine the early mornings, still dark and cold, the woman making her way to the byre, lantern in hand, to sit patiently beneath a cow drawing forth the warm, vital liquid. This fresh milk was the basis for much of the family's diet and a crucial source of nutrients. Beyond the act of milking itself, women were typically responsible for the immediate processing of that milk. It had to be strained, stored properly, and then quickly transformed into more stable products like cheese and butter before it spoiled. This involved intricate knowledge of fermentation, curdling, and churning, skills passed down through generations. A bad batch of cheese meant lost nutrients and lost potential income. The consistent provision of milk and its transformation into valuable dairy products was an absolutely fundamental contribution to the farm's food security and potential for market trade. Beyond milking, women often took primary responsibility for the care of young animals. Calves, lambs, piglets, and chicks were particularly vulnerable in their early stages of life. They required constant attention, feeding, and protection from predators and disease. It was often the woman who would nurse a sick lamb back to health, who would ensure the piglets had enough warmth and nourishment, or who would gather the fragile eggs from the chicken coop, protecting them from breakage and predation. This delicate care of the young was paramount for ensuring the growth of the farm's animal stock. Without the survival of these young animals, the herd or flock would diminish, directly impacting the farm's long-term productivity and wealth. Imagine a woman gently coaxing a weak lamb to feed, or carefully monitoring a brooding hen, her watchful eye ensuring the future generation of farm animals. This nurturing role, often seen as an extension of their role in child rearing, was nonetheless a crucial aspect of animal husbandry that directly translated into economic value for the farm. Poultry management, including chickens, ducks, and geese, was almost exclusively the domain of women. These smaller animals were essential for providing eggs and meat, crucial protein sources for the family, and often a reliable source of small income through local market exchange. Women were responsible for feeding the birds, collecting eggs, cleaning the coops, and managing the brooding hens and their chicks. This daily interaction with the poultry, understanding their needs and behaviors, was vital for maximizing their output. Imagine a woman scattering grain to a flock of eager chickens or carefully checking nests for freshly laid eggs, her hands stained with dirt and feathers. Consistency of their care ensured a steady supply of these vital resources, a constant low-level flow of food and income that underpins the larger farm economy. The smaller yet vital animals also included pigs. While pigs might be herded by men to acorn forests, their daily care around the homestead, their feeding, and the management of their litters often fell to women. Pigs were incredibly important for their meat and fat, providing crucial calories and protein, especially during winter. Processes of salting, smoking, and rendering lard from slaughtered pigs were also primarily tasks performed by women, turning a perishable animal into a long-lasting and valuable food source. This was a complex, labor-intensive process that required significant skill and knowledge of preservation techniques. The entire cycle, from raising the piglet to transforming its meat, often involved women at every critical juncture. Furthermore, women's deep understanding of herbal remedies and traditional healing practices extended to animal care. While a professional animal doctor might have been rare or non-existent in many villages, women often held the accumulated knowledge of how to treat common ailments in farm animals, using poultices, herbal infusions, or other traditional methods. They might have a remedy for a swollen udder in a cow, or a digestive issue in a goat. This informal veterinary knowledge, passed down through generations, was crucial for preventing disease outbreaks and maintaining the health of the farm's livestock. A healthy animal was a productive animal, and the woman's skill in basic animal first aid and preventive care was a direct contribution to the farm's productivity and economic well-being. This was a vital form of knowledge work, often unwritten and therefore overlooked in official histories. The role of women in breeding and selection, particularly for smaller animals, was also often profound. While male decision-makers might choose a bull or ram, women were often the ones who observed the traits of their poultry, their pigs, or even their dairy animals over time. Understanding which hens were good layers, which sows produced healthy litters, or which cows gave the richest milk. This continuous detailed observation informed decisions about which animals to keep for breeding and which to cull, directly influencing the genetic health and productivity of the farm's smaller livestock. This wasn't just passive observation. It was an active contribution to the genetic improvement of the farm's animal resources, a form of biological expertise often unrecognized. In essence, women were the constant, consistent presence in the lives of many farm animals. While men might engage in the more dramatic tasks like castration, shearing, or slaughter, women's labor was the daily, often invisible thread that kept the animals alive, healthy, and productive. Their patient feeding, their meticulous cleaning, their tender care for the young and the sick, and their expert processing of animal products were all absolutely fundamental to the farm's survival and economic output. Yet, because these tasks were often integrated into the domestic sphere or seen as mere routine, they were not recorded with the same significance as male-dominated animal husbandry activities. This oversight leaves us with an incomplete picture of the true labor and expertise involved in raising livestock in 770, and obscuring the monumental contributions of women who were the true continuous custodians of the farm's animal wealth. Number 2. The silent science of seeds and soil. The act of farming is often romanticized as a battle against nature, a grand human effort to tame the wild earth and coerce it into yielding bounty. In this narrative, the farmer is depicted as the master of the land, understanding its rhythms and dictating its yield. But in 770, at a profound, essential knowledge, deeply intertwined with the delicate balance of seeds and soil, was often held by women, and this silent science was consistently overlooked, despite being absolutely critical to the success and sustainability of the farm. This was not a written science, but an empirical one, passed down through observation, experimentation, and experience. A knowledge base built through generations of women's direct engagement with the earth. Consider the intricate art of seed selection and saving. In 770 AD, farmers didn't just buy bags of seeds from a store, they meticulously saved seeds from the previous harvest. This was not a random process. Women, who were often deeply involved in the harvest and processing of crops, would frequently be the ones to observe and select the best individual plants for future generations. They knew which stalks of grain were the plumpest, which vegetables yielded the most vigorous seeds, and which herbs produced the most potent leaves. They understood that the quality of the seed directly impacted the next year's harvest. Imagine a woman carefully sifting through harvested grain, picking out the largest, healthiest kernels, separating them from the chaff and diseased specimens. This careful discernment, this instinctive understanding of plant genetics before genetics was even a concept, was vital. They were the custodians of genetic diversity on the farm, ensuring that resilient, productive varieties were perpetuated year after year. Without their keen eye and meticulous selection, crops would gradually weaken, yields would dwindle, and the farm would face existential threats. This wasn't merely collecting seeds. It was an ongoing process of crop improvement, a form of applied botany that was foundational to agricultural success. Beyond selection, the proper storage of seeds was another critical skill. Seeds had to be kept dry, cool, and safe from pests, mold, and rodents throughout the long winter months. Women were responsible for maintaining the seed stores, often in carefully prepared granaries or storage containers. Their knowledge of environmental conditions, their constant vigilance against spoilage, and their understanding of how to protect these vital future harvests were paramount. A single mistake in storage could mean the loss of the next year's crop, leading to widespread hunger. Imagine the careful stacking of dried seed bundles, the checking for moisture, the constant battle against vermin. This was a continuous, unseen labor that guaranteed the continuity of the farm's productive cycle. Women also held a deep, practical understanding of soil health and fertility, often gained through years of direct interaction with the land in kitchen gardens and smaller plots. While men might be concerned with the broad fertility of fields for major grain crops, women understood the microclimates and specific needs of different plants within the more intensively cultivated garden areas. They knew which areas of the soil needed enrichment, where compost should be applied, and how to rotate certain crops to maintain soil vitality for vegetables and herbs. Their daily engagement with these smaller, but no less essential plots, gave them a nuanced perspective on soil composition and how to maintain its life-giving properties without modern fertilizers. They understood the signs of depleted soil and intuitively knew how to replenish it using organic matter from the farm or household waste. Their knowledge extended to the identification and management of plant diseases and pests. While they lacked microscopes or advanced scientific terminology, women were keen observers. They could identify early signs of blight on a potato plant or the telltale munch marks of a particular insect on a cabbage leaf. More importantly, they knew traditional remedies and preventative measures, often using companion planting, specific herbs, or natural repellents to protect their valuable crops. This was a form of integrated pest management developed through centuries of trial and error, ensuring the health and productivity of the family's food supply. Imagine a woman noticing a particular discoloration on a leaf and instinctively knowing to apply a certain herbal concoction or to remove the affected plant before the disease spread. This practical, effective knowledge was invaluable. Cultivation of kitchen gardens was a domain where women's silent science truly shone. These gardens were not merely supplementary. They were often the primary source of vegetables, herbs, and sometimes even small grains or legumes that provided daily sustenance and essential nutrients. Unlike the vast single crop fields, these gardens were diverse ecosystems, requiring detailed knowledge of different plant needs, planting times, and harvesting methods. Women planned the layout of these gardens, managed their daily care, and understood the nuanced requirements of each plant. They knew when to plant specific seeds based on lunar cycles or weather patterns, a form of folk meteorology and astronomy applied directly to agriculture. This knowledge ensured a continuous supply of fresh produce throughout the growing season and provided the raw materials for their extensive food preservation efforts. Furthermore, women were often the keepers of knowledge about wild edibles and medicinal plants. While not strictly farming, this extensive botanical knowledge augmented the farm's resources and provided crucial supplements to the diet, especially in times of scarcity or vital remedies for illness. They knew where to find certain berries, mushrooms, or wild greens, and how to prepare them safely. They also understood the medicinal properties of countless plants, turning wild flora into a natural pharmacy for the family and livestock. This expertise reduced a farm's reliance on cultivated crops for all its needs, demonstrating a broader ecological understanding and contributing to the overall self-sufficiency and resilience of the farm household. The reason this profound knowledge was often overlooked and unrecorded lies in its nature. It was experiential, practical, and passed down orally from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. It wasn't codified in Latin texts or formal treatises, which were the purview of male scholars and monastic scribes. It was embedded in daily practice, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the calloused hands that worked the soil. Because it wasn't documented in the patriarchal structures of written history, it became invisible. Yet, without this deep intuitive understanding of seeds, soil, plants, and the intricate dance of nature, the agricultural systems of 770 AD would have been far less productive, far less resilient, and ultimately far less capable of feeding entire populations. Women were the silent scientists of the farm, their wisdom woven into the very fabric of the earth they tirelessly nurtured. Number 1. Lost in the oral tradition. Their stories and innovations in the medieval world of 770, at the stories that survived and were passed down, especially those committed to parchment or carved into stone, were overwhelmingly about men, kings, knights, monks, and landowners. These narratives focused on battles, laws, religious doctrines, and the grand structures of power. Even when agricultural practices were mentioned, they were typically described from the perspective of the male head of the household or the landholder. What this top-down historical record missed was the vast, vibrant tapestry of knowledge, innovation, and daily experience that lived within the oral traditions of farming communities, a tradition largely shaped and maintained by women. Their unique stories and crucial innovations, born of necessity and passed through generations of practical application, were almost entirely lost to formal history. Imagine a group of women gathered around a fire in the evening after a long day in the fields. They might be spinning wool or mending clothes, but they are also sharing knowledge. One woman might recount a particularly difficult harvest year and how her grandmother taught her to preserve certain foods in a new way, allowing the family to survive. Another might describe a clever method for deterring pests from the kitchen garden, a trick she learned from her mother. These were not just anecdotes. They were vital lessons, practical instructions, and shared wisdom, refined over centuries of collective experience. This was the original knowledge transfer, happening organically, orally, and primarily within female networks. Yet none of these specific practical innovations, none of these ingenious solutions to daily farming challenges would ever find their way into a monastic chronicle or a manorial survey. They were simply part of the unwritten rules of survival, vital for the community, but invisible to the historians who would later write about the period. Consider the incremental innovations born out of necessity. Perhaps a woman discovered that a particular type of wild plant when planted near a certain vegetable kept harmful insects away, or she realized that storing seeds in a specific type of clay pot, buried in a certain part of the cellar, prevented spoilage more effectively. Maybe she developed a more efficient way to churn butter, reducing the physical effort, or devised a clever system for drying herbs that preserved their potency longer. These weren't grand inventions like the heavy plow. They were small, continuous improvements born from daily observation and repeated effort, directly impacting productivity, efficiency, and survival. These small-scale innovations, often related to seed saving, food preservation, basic animal care, and garden management, were the cumulative result of women's direct engagement with the daily rhythms of the farm. They were a form of practical ingenuity, born of the need to feed a family with limited resources and facing constant environmental challenges. Yet precisely because they were incremental, domestic, and often related to what was considered women's work, they were rarely recognized as innovations in the same way that a new farming tool might be. They simply became part of the accepted way of doing things, the common knowledge that was passed down their origins and the ingenuity of their female inventors, completely forgotten. The very nature of historical record-keeping in 770 AD contributed to this erasure. Formal records were typically created by literate men, often monks, clerks, or landowners' agents. Their focus was on legal matters, land tenure, taxation, and the activities of powerful individuals. The daily routines of peasants, especially women, were not deemed worthy of detailed documentation. A land survey might list the number of hides, units of land, and the male tenants, but it would not delve into the daily efforts of the women who tilled the land, processed its yield, or managed the household. Their existence was acknowledged implicitly as part of the family unit, but their individual contributions, their specific skills, and their ingenious adaptations were simply not considered relevant to the formal record. This systemic bias in documentation meant that entire swaths of human experience and contribution were rendered historically silent. Furthermore, the societal structures themselves often devalued women's intellectual and practical contributions. Wisdom, knowledge, and innovation were often associated with formal learning, religious texts, or public discourse, arenas from which women were largely excluded. The knowledge held by women was seen as folk wisdom or traditional practices, valuable perhaps, but not on par with the serious knowledge held by men. This cultural perception contributed to the overlooking of their ingenuity. Even if a woman's innovation demonstrably improved the farm's output or made life easier, it would often be attributed implicitly to the household as a whole, or simply integrated into the general practice without specific credit. The stories of women's resilience, their ingenuity in the face of famine or disease, their profound understanding of the natural world, and their tireless efforts were woven into the fabric of daily life, into songs, lullabies, and cautionary tales passed down through generations. These oral traditions were rich with knowledge, but they were fragile. They depended on continuous transmission and could be easily lost or distorted over time. When societies shifted, when communities dispersed, or when written records became the dominant form of historical preservation, these oral traditions and the women's stories embedded within them often faded into obscurity. Unlike the written chronicles that endured for centuries in monasteries, the spoken word, however vital to its own time, left few lasting traces for future historians. So, when we look back at farming in 770 AD, we must actively seek to recover these lost stories. We must understand that the quiet diligence in the garden, the precise movements in the dairy, the careful selection of seeds, and the resourceful preservation of food were not just mundane tasks. They were acts of profound knowledge, skilled labor, and constant innovation, often driven by women, ensuring the very survival of their families and communities. Their contributions, though unwritten and uncelebrated in their own time, were the essential, silent force that kept the agricultural world turning. Without them, the picture of medieval farming is incomplete, missing the crucial stories of half of humanity's labor, wisdom, and ingenuity, stories that remain largely lost in the echoes of an oral tradition.